The Vorath Empire had conquered 47 star systems in the past century, which sounds impressive until you realize they'd been doing this for the past 6 centuries and really should have gotten better at math by now. Their military doctrine was simple: overwhelming force, absolute obedience, and a hierarchical structure so rigid that even their org charts needed structural support beams. It worked, though. Can't argue with success, even if that success is built on the broken backs of species who'd rather enjoyed not being conquered. Warlord Draven. Yes, his parents actually named him that because apparently the Vorath believed in destiny, or just really bad parenting, stood on the bridge of his flagship with the posture of someone who'd never been told no in his entire life. He was approximately 7 feet of scales, muscle, and what humans would generously call anger management issues. His species had evolved from apex predators, which explained the teeth. It did not explain the ego, but evolution can only do so much. The holographic display before him showed a small vessel, laughably small by Vorath standards, drifting through what the Empire had declared restricted space approximately 3 hours ago. The declaration had been transmitted across all standard frequencies, which meant anyone with a working receiver knew to stay out. This ship, however, had apparently missed the memo, or ignored it. With the newest species the galaxy had discovered, it was genuinely hard to tell which was more likely. Humans. The word carried a certain novelty in galactic circles, like a new flavor of food that nobody was quite sure was safe to eat. They'd stumbled onto the interstellar stage roughly 2 years ago with technology that looked like it had been assembled in someone's garage, and according to intelligence reports, some of it actually had been. The Galactic Observatory had classified them as emerging primitive, with a footnote that read shows promise but probably won't survive first contact with serious military power. Draven intended to prove that footnote correct. Status. He barked at his tactical officer, who jumped approximately 3 inches before composing herself. Good. Fear kept the ranks efficient. The human vessel remains on its current trajectory, Warlord. They've responded to our hails with a request for clarification on the restricted zone designation. They claim their navigation charts don't show this area as prohibited space. Because we prohibited it 3 hours ago, Draven said, his voice carrying the patience of someone explaining basic concepts to a particularly slow child. They're either incompetent or deliberately provocative. His second-in-command, a grizzled veteran named Horsk, who'd seen enough combat to know when to keep his mouth shut, didn't keep his mouth shut. Perhaps they genuinely didn't receive the transmission in time to alter course, Warlord. Their faster-than-light travel is rudimentary. Draven turned to Horsk with the kind of look that had made junior officers reconsider their career choices. And perhaps they need to learn that ignorance is not a defense in Vorath space. Prepare boarding teams. We'll make an example of this vessel. Let the humans understand what happens when they ignore our authority. The crew moved with practiced efficiency, because in the Vorath military you either moved with practiced efficiency, or you found yourself assigned to waste reclamation duty on a mining colony. Draven watched the preparations with satisfaction. This would be simple, clean, and instructive. The humans would surrender immediately. They always did, these primitive species, and he'd secure another footnote in his already impressive military record. The boarding craft launched, sleek predatory things that looked like they'd been designed by someone who really enjoyed the aesthetic of intimidation. They crossed the distance to the human vessel in minutes, clamping onto the hull with magnetic grapplers that could punch through standard defensive plating. The human ship, to its credit, didn't fire a single shot, didn't even power up weapons system, just sat there like a particularly confused spacefaring turtle. They're not resisting, Horsk observed, which earned him another look from Draven. Why would they? They know they're outmatched. Draven activated his personal communication channel to the boarding team leader. Commander Fell, report. Breaching now, Warlord. The sound of cutting equipment screamed through the audio feed, followed by the distinctive hiss of atmosphere equalization. We're inside. Initial scans show 17 life signs. Minimal defensive positions. This is almost disappointing. Almost disappointing. Draven allowed himself a small smile. The Vorath appreciated efficiency, but they also appreciated a good fight. These humans were providing neither. Just another species learning that the galaxy belonged to the strong. The boarding team's helmet cameras fed directly to the bridge display, giving Draven a first-person view of the operation. The interior of the human vessel looked exactly like the intelligence reports had suggested. functional, cramped and assembled with the kind of aesthetic sensibility that suggested the designers had prioritized, does it work over does it look impressive? Pipes ran along exposed ceiling. Lighting came from simple panels rather than elegant bioluminescent strips. Even the corridors were painted in flat, boring colors. And yet, as the boarding team advanced through the ship, something felt off. The humans weren't cowering, they weren't running, they were simply waiting, standing in their corridors with their hands visible, making no aggressive moves, but also showing no real fear. It was unsettling in a way Draven couldn't quite articulate. There, Commander Fell's voice cut through the observation. Two of them appear to be command person. The camera focused on two figures, standing in what looked like the vessel's central corridor. One was a human male in military attire at least. Draven assumed it was military attire based on the uniform structure and the sidearm holstered at his hip. He was tall for his species, perhaps 6 feet, with the kind of stance that suggested combat training. His face was impassive, almost bored, as if armed aliens boarding his ship was a minor inconvenience rather than a life-threatening situation. The other was a human female in what appeared to be diplomatic clothing, though diplomatic was a generous term for the simple suit she wore. She stood with her hands clasped behind her back, chin slightly raised, meeting the camera's gaze with an expression that could only be described as amused. Actually amused. As if this entire situation was some kind of elaborate joke that only she understood. Secure them, Draven ordered. Bring them to their vessel's bridge. I want to address them personally. Because sometimes you needed to deliver lessons face to face. Sometimes you needed to look a species in the eye when you crushed their hopes for peaceful coexistence. The Vorath had learned over centuries of conquest that personal intimidation worked better than any weapon system ever could. The boarding team surrounded the two humans, weapons trained, shouting orders in Galactic standard that the universal translators would render intelligible. The male didn't move. The female simply tilted her head slightly as if considering something philosophical, and then nodded once. They walked willingly toward the bridge, flanked by Vorath soldiers in full combat armor. Draven transferred his consciousness, transmitted his holographic presence, but consciousness sounded more impressive to the human vessel's bridge. The technology was primitive, but functional enough to support his projection. He materialized in front of the two humans, towering over them with every photon of intimidation his species had perfected over millennia. I am Warlord, Draven of the Vorath Empire, he began, his voice modulated to carry maximum authoritative weight. You have violated restricted space. Your species is now subject to imperial judgment. The female smiled, actually smiled, like she'd just been told a moderately funny joke at a dinner party. Commander Fell, Draven continued, ignoring the unsettling expression. Execute the male. Let the female return to her people with the message that humanity exists at our sufferance. It was a standard technique. Kill the military personnel, spare the diplomat to carry the warning. Simple, effective, and it usually resulted in immediate compliance from primitive species, who suddenly realized their mistake in challenging Vorath authority. Commander Fell raised his weapon, pointing it directly at the human soldier's head. The soldier didn't flinch, didn't plead, just stood there with that same expression of mild boredom, as if being executed was somewhere between filing paperwork and sitting in traffic on his list of daily inconveniences. Soldier, Fell said in Galactic standard. Kneel. The human soldier looked at him, then looked at the female diplomat. Then, in a move that would later be analyzed by military strategists across 17 star systems, did something completely unexpected. He stepped sideways, positioning himself between the diplomat and the Vorath weapons, and slowly, deliberately, lowered his sidearm to the deck with a metallic clank that echoed through the suddenly silent bridge. Now, in Draven's extensive experience with subjugating species across the galaxy, this was not how executions typically proceeded. The usual sequence involved begging, sometimes crying, occasionally a last-minute attempt at heroics that ended poorly for everyone involved. What did not happen was the condemned soldier, calmly repositioning himself to shield the person who was supposed to survive, while simultaneously disarming himself and somehow making the entire Vorath boarding team look like they'd just failed a basic comprehension test. Commander Fell blinked, which for a Vorath required the coordination of 3 separate eyelids, and suggested profound confusion. Soldier, you misunderstand. Step away from the female. You have been sentenced to. The The human's voice was flat, uninflected, carrying about as much emotion as a shipping manifest. He remained exactly where he was, hands now visible and empty at his sides, still standing between the diplomat and a dozen armed Vorath warriors, who could collectively turn him into a fine organic mist. Draven felt something he hadn't experienced in approximately 2 decades of military command: uncertainty. It started as a small thing, a tiny crack in his absolute confidence, like the first fracture in a dam before the catastrophic failure. "Commander Fell, I gave you an order. Execute the prisoner." "Warlord, he's not complying with standard execution protocols." "Then make him comply." Draven's holographic form flickered with his rising anger, which looked impressive, but was ultimately just fancy photons having a tantrum. "Move him aside and complete your mission." 2 Vorath soldiers stepped forward, reaching for the human's shoulders to physically relocate him. The soldier didn't resist. He simply became very heavy and very immovable, using his center of gravity and body mechanics in a way that suggested extensive training in being an absolute pain to move. The 2 soldiers pulled, pushed and generally exerted themselves in a manner that would have been comedic if it weren't so professionally embarrassing. Behind the soldier, the diplomat spoke for the first time. "You should probably listen to him." Her voice carried none of the fear Draven expected. Instead, she sounded like a professor watching students fail an experiment she'd already explained 3 times. Patient, but disappointed in their lack of attention. "The female speaks," Draven said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Tell your soldier to step aside. His death is already decided. His defiance only prolongs the inevitable." "See, that's where you're making your first mistake," she replied, shifting her weight slightly. The soldier adjusted his position fractionally, maintaining his protective stance without being asked. "You're assuming his defiance is about self-preservation. It's not. He's making a choice." "Choices are luxuries afforded to the powerful," Draven said, reciting what was practically Vorath doctrine. "Your species is not powerful, therefore you have no choices." The diplomat laughed, a sound that bounced off the cramped bridge walls and somehow made the dozen armed Vorath soldiers look uncertain. "Oh, that's beautiful. That's absolutely perfect. You've conquered 47 systems, and you still don't understand the most basic principle of warfare." Commander Fell's weapon remained trained on the soldier's head, but his grip had shifted slightly. Hesitation Draven recognized with growing horror. His commander was hesitating, because nothing about this situation matched their training or experience. "Enlighten me," Draven said, his voice ice. "What principle do the mighty humans understand that we do not?" "That loyalty isn't programmed," the soldier said, speaking again without looking away from the Vorath weapons. "It's chosen. Every single, and right now I'm choosing not to let you execute an unarmed diplomat, because some overgrown lizard with authority issues decided to throw a tantrum in restricted space you designated 3 hours ago." The silence that followed could have been weaponized. Somewhere on the Vorath flagship, a junior officer probably had a stress-induced medical event. Draven's holographic form solidified with rage, every pixel of his projection radiating the kind of fury that had leveled cities and broken planetary government. "You dare?" "Yeah, I dare," the soldier interrupted, which was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, and Draven was beginning to suspect it was both. "You want to shoot me? Go ahead, but you'll have to explain to your superiors why you executed a military officer who was actively surrendering, and then you'll have to explain why the diplomat you were supposed to leave alive witnessed you murdering a non-combatant in violation of approximately 17 interstellar warfare conventions." Behind him, the diplomat smiled wider. "He's been taking law classes, correspondence courses. Very thorough." Other sounds filtered through the audio feed now, movement throughout the human vessel, the Vorath boarding teams reporting in with increasingly confused observations. The other human crew members weren't resisting, but they weren't exactly complying either. They were simply standing there, waiting, watching their military personnel with expressions that suggested they were all in on some collective joke that the Vorath hadn't been invited to. "This is absurd," Commander Fell said, voicing what everyone was thinking. "Warlord, permission to subdue the prisoner by force and proceed with execution." Draven opened his mouth to give that permission, to authorize whatever force necessary to complete this simple, straightforward execution that had somehow become the most complicated moment of his military career. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the soldier's unwavering stance. Maybe it was the diplomat's knowing smile.
Maybe it was the growing realization that he'd walked into something far more complex than a simple border violation. Or maybe it was the alert that suddenly screamed across every Vorath communication channel, informing him that 63 different galactic news networks had somehow acquired live feeds of his boarding operation, and were currently broadcasting this standoff to approximately 400 billion viewers across known space. The humans, it seemed, believed in documentation. Retry Claude, can make mistakes, please double-check responses.
The thing about galactic news networks is that they operated on a simple principle: if it bleeds, it leads, and if it embarrasses a major military power, it goes viral across 17 star systems, before you can say operational security breach. Draven watched his tactical display light up with transmission signatures, like some kind of horrible technological Christmas tree, each one representing another media outlet that had decided his career was about to become very entertaining content. "How?" he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Are they broadcasting from inside my operational theater?" His communications officer, who'd been having a very bad day that was about to get considerably worse, stammered through an explanation. "Sir, the human vessel's entire hull appears to be embedded with micro-transmission arrays. They've been streaming since we initiated boarding procedures. We didn't detect them because they're using a completely novel encoding method that turned them off. We've tried, sir. The arrays are hardened against electronic warfare and physically inaccessible without dismantling their entire ship, which would take approximately 6 hours and several specialized cutting tools we don't have on hand." Draven turned his attention back to the diplomat, who had somehow produced a small data pad from her jacket pocket and was reviewing it with the casual interest of someone checking their grocery list. "You planned this?" "Well, obviously," she said, not looking up. "Did you think we just accidentally wandered into your freshly restricted space with a ship full of recording equipment and a crisis-trained crew? Come on, Warlord. Give us some credit. We're primitive, not stupid." "There's a difference, though I understand the Vorath educational system doesn't really emphasize that distinction." The soldier shifted his weight infinitesimally, and 3 Vorath weapons tracked the movement. He didn't seem bothered. If anything, he looked more relaxed now than when they'd first boarded, as if having guns pointed at him was somehow less stressful than whatever his normal job entailed. Draven made a mental note to review human psychological profiles, assuming he survived the next 10 minutes with his career intact. "You're bluffing," Draven said with approximately zero conviction. "Humanity lacks the political capital to challenge Vorath authority. You're a 2-year-old spacefaring species with barely 12 colony worlds and a military that still uses projectile weapons alongside your energy systems." "True," the diplomat agreed cheerfully, finally looking up from her data pad. "We're also the species that every single one of your subjugated populations is currently watching stand up to you on live broadcast. Tell me, Warlord, how long do you think your empire stays stable when 47 conquered species watch a single human soldier refuse your direct order and survive?" The crack in Draven's certainty widened into a chasm. He'd spent 3 decades studying military strategy, tactical operations, and the application of overwhelming force. What he hadn't studied, because the Vorath educational system considered it irrelevant, was political theater. The humans apparently had taken a different approach to their curriculum. "Commander Fell," Draven said, trying to regain control of a situation that was rapidly approaching the event horizon of complete disaster. "New orders. Secure both prisoners unharmed and prepare to withdraw from the vessel." Finally, the soldier muttered, which was probably not the response Draven had expected from someone who'd just had their execution postponed. "Thought we'd be here all day." "Stand down," the diplomat said quietly, and the soldier immediately relaxed his protective stance. Though Draven noticed he didn't step aside, just adjusted his position to something less aggressively defensive while maintaining himself between the Vorath weapons and the diplomat. Training, Draven realized. Extensive, thorough training in exactly this scenario. They'd practiced this, probably dozens of times. The humans had wargamed a confrontation with the Vorath Empire and determined that their best weapon wasn't firepower. It was embarrassment. "You're not taking anyone prisoner," the diplomat continued, her tone shifting from cheerful to professionally cold in a way that suggested Draven wasn't the only one who'd spent decades studying their craft. "What you're going to do is withdraw your boarding teams, return to your flagship and file an incident report explaining how you ordered the execution of a surrendering military officer on live broadcast in violation of the Galactic Warfare Conventions that your empire signed approximately 40 years ago. The conventions don't apply to Article 7, Section 3. The soldier interrupted. Apparently his legal correspondence courses had been very thorough indeed. All signatory species agree to afford basic protections to military personnel who have clearly indicated surrender through recognized gestures, including but not limited to disarmament, cessation of hostile action, and visible compliance with captor instructions. I disarm. I stopped being hostile. I'm very visibly complying apart from the whole not wanting to die thing. The diplomat's datapad beeped. She glanced at it and smiled in a way that made Draven's scales itch. Oh, excellent timing. Warlord, I'm receiving notifications that the Galactic Arbitration Council has just opened an inquiry into this incident. That's fast even for them. They must be watching the live feeds too. Every species in the galaxy understood the Galactic Arbitration Council represented something more dangerous than weapons, consequences. They couldn't stop wars, but they could make them politically expensive. Economic sanctions, trade embargoes, and the kind of diplomatic isolation that turned mighty empires into historical footnotes. The Vorath had avoided council attention for decades by keeping their conquests surgical and their atrocities deniable. There was nothing deniable about executing someone on 400 billion simultaneous live streams. This is extortion, Draven said, because sometimes stating the obvious was all you had left. No, this is politics, the diplomat corrected. Extortion would be if we demanded something in exchange for not releasing this footage. We've already released. What happens next depends entirely on whether you want your military legacy to be that warlord who got outmaneuvered by primitives or that warlord who showed restraint under unprecedented circumstances. Your choice. Humans are big on choices. Throughout the human vessel, Draven's boarding teams were reporting similar situations. Human crew members standing in passive resistance, not fighting but not cooperating, and definitely recording everything with personal devices that seemed to multiply like some kind of technological bacteria. His carefully planned demonstration of power had become a demonstration of something else entirely. Adaptability. That's what the early reports on humanity had meant. They'd catalogued the weapons, the ships, the colonies, but nobody had thought to measure how quickly humans could learn, adjust and weaponize the galaxy's own rules against itself. Commander Fell, Draven said, each word physically painful. Withdraw all teams. Return to the flagship, sir. Fell's confusion was palpable. We have them secured. We could continue providing entertainment to half the galaxy while the Arbitration Council prepares sanctions that would cripple our supply lines for a decade. Draven snapped. Withdraw. Now, the Vorath soldiers backed away. Weapons still trained on the humans but clearly no longer committed to the engagement. The soldier remained motionless until the last Vorath had exited the bridge, then calmly retrieved his sidearm from the deck, checked the power cell with practiced efficiency, and holstered it without once pointing it at anything threatening. For what it's worth, the diplomat called out as the boarding teams retreated, you made the right choice. Humanity actually respects that. Draven's holographic form dissipated without response, because sometimes dignity meant knowing when to shut up and accept that you'd been comprehensively, professionally outplayed by a species that still thought projectile weapons were perfectly acceptable military technology. Retry Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. Part 4. The journey back to Vorath High Command was approximately 16 hours of faster-than-light travel, which gave Draven plenty of time to contemplate the various ways his career was about to become a cautionary tale told to junior officers. The viewing statistics for the incident had climbed to 600 billion before his communications officer wisely stopped updating him. Apparently, watching a Vorath warlord get schooled in interstellar law by a species that had discovered anti-gravity propulsion approximately 8 years ago was the most entertaining thing to happen in galactic media since that incident with the Peltharian ambassador and the ceremonial food sculpture. His tactical staff maintained professional silence during the trip, which Draven appreciated because the alternative was discussing how thoroughly they'd been outmaneuvered by what their intelligence briefs had classified as emerging primitive with limited strategic capability. Those briefs were probably being rewritten right now by very nervous intelligence analysts,
who suddenly realized their jobs had become significantly more complicated. The Galactic Arbitration Council's inquiry had expanded from preliminary to formal investigation in approximately 4 hours, which was breakneck speed for an organization that normally operated on geological timescales. 17 member species had filed supporting statements, most of them barely disguised versions of "finally someone stood up to the Vorath." The Peltherian delegation had apparently submitted a 3,000-word document that was mostly applause transcribed into legal language. Worse, the subjugated populations throughout Vorath-controlled space had indeed noticed. Reports filtered in of minor civil disobedience on 6 colony worlds, nothing serious yet, but the kind of early tremors that suggested the ground was less stable than previously assumed. Turns out when 47 conquered species watched a single human refuse orders and survive, they started remembering they could refuse orders too. Who knew? Well, apparently the humans knew. They'd planned for it. Draven materialized his holographic presence in the War Council chamber expecting immediate censure. Instead he found something worse, thoughtful expression. The 12 members of the High Command sat in their ceremonial positions, reviewing data feeds and incident reports with the kind of careful attention that suggested they were actually thinking rather than simply reacting. Dangerous territory. Supreme Commander Velin, a scarred veteran who'd personally led the conquests of 11 star systems and had approximately 0 patience for failure, gestured for Draven to approach. Warlord, explain how a routine border enforcement became the most watched military incident in recorded galactic history. The humans anticipated our response, Draven said, because there was no point in sugarcoating strategic failure. They deliberately violated restricted space, knowing we would board their vessel. Everything that followed was orchestrated to maximize political damage while minimizing actual military conflict. They turned your strength into weakness, another council member observed, a younger officer named Grell who specialized in unconventional warfare analysis. By not fighting, they made fighting impossible. Clever. It's absurd, countered Vel. A military force that refuses combat isn't a military force, it's a debate team with fancy ships. A debate team that just convinced half the galaxy we're war criminals, Draven pointed out, which earned him several sharp looks. The Arbitration Council is reviewing 17 separate convention violations. Our trade partners are requesting clarification on our commitment to interstellar law, and we're receiving reports of unrest on 6 colony worlds, where populations suddenly remembered they don't actually like being conquered. The council chamber fell silent except for the ambient hum of holographic displays processing too much bad news simultaneously. The Vorath Empire had maintained stability through overwhelming military superiority for 6 centuries. Nobody had ever thought to question what happened when military superiority became politically unusable. The human soldier, Grell said, reviewing the footage again on his personal display. He didn't hesitate, the order was given, and he immediately chose Defiance. That level of conviction suggests systematic training in resisting authority. They're preparing their military for confrontations where following orders would be strategically disobeyed. They're preparing for us, Draven said flatly. Every human in that vessel knew exactly what would happen. They drilled this scenario, until refusing a direct execution order became muscle memory. That kind of training doesn't happen accidentally. Supreme Commander Velin deactivated his display and fixed Draven with a look that had sent countless subordinates scrambling for cover. Assessment. Can we conquer humanity through conventional military means? Yes, Draven answered immediately, because lying to the War Council was a faster career ender than any tactical failure. Their fleet is smaller, their technology inferior in most categories, their territorial holdings limited. In a direct military confrontation, we would achieve victory within 6 months. But they wouldn't give us a direct military confrontation. They'd give us 600 billion live viewers watching us enforce that victory. Every battle would be documented, analyzed and broadcast to species throughout our empire who would suddenly remember they have choices too. We'd win the war and lose the empire. Another council member, Prax, who'd been silent throughout the discussion, finally spoke. The humans understand something we've forgotten. Power isn't just the ability to destroy, it's the ability to make destruction unnecessary. By refusing to fight, that soldier made himself more powerful than our entire boarding team. That's philosophical nonsense, Villain growled. Power comes from force. Then explain why we withdrew, Prax countered. We had overwhelming force, we had tactical superiority, we had every advantage except one. We couldn't use any of it without proving the humans' point. That's not philosophy. That's strategy we've never encountered, because we've never fought an opponent willing to lose individual battles to win the broader political war. The implications settled over the council chamber like particularly depressing snow. The Vorath Empire had built 6 centuries of dominance on straightforward military doctrine, overwhelming force applied without hesitation. The humans had just demonstrated that doctrine had a critical vulnerability. You could have all the weapons in the galaxy and still lose if your opponent made using those weapons more costly than surrender. Recommendations? Villain asked, which was as close to admitting confusion as the Supreme Commander ever came. Avoid direct confrontation with humanity, Draven said, mentally composing his resignation as he spoke. Classify them as politically hazardous, rather than militarily significant. Open diplomatic channels and treat them as near peers, rather than primitive. And most importantly, never, under any circumstances, give them an opportunity to make us look like war criminals on live broadcast again. That's not conquest, Villain observed. That's retreat. That's adaptation, Grell correct. The humans have been spacefaring for 2 years, and they've already figured out how to neutralize our primary strategic advantage. Imagine what they'll develop in 10 years, 20. We can either acknowledge them as legitimate political actors now, or we can fight a war that destroys our credibility with every species we've conquered. The vote, when it came, was closer than Draven expected. 7-5 in favor of diplomatic engagement rather than military action. The Vorath Empire's first strategic retreat in living memory, decided not on a battlefield, but in a council chamber, forced by a single human soldier who'd chosen to lower his weapon. 3 weeks later, formal diplomatic relations opened between the Vorath Empire and humanity. The human delegation arrived in vessels that were still comically primitive by galactic standards, but nobody mentioned it. They'd learned that lesson. The diplomat from the incident led the negotiations, flanked by security personnel who included one very familiar soldier. He stood at parade rest throughout the proceedings, sidearm holstered, expression professionally neutral. Draven attended as military liaison, a position that was technically prestigious, and actually meant he was the designated scapegoat if negotiations failed. The diplomat caught his eye during a break in proceedings, and walked over with the confidence of someone who'd won before the game even started. Warlord, she said, extending her hand in the human gesture of greeting. No hard feeling. Your species weaponized our own legal system against us, Draven replied, but took the offered hand because diplomatic protocols mattered now apparently. You turned a border violation into a political crisis that nearly destabilized 6-colony world. We prefer to think of it as aggressive negotiations, she said with that same knowing smile. Besides, you were going to execute him. We just made sure the entire galaxy understood what that meant. The soldier, standing slightly behind and to her left, maintained his professional silence. But Draven noticed the way his eyes tracked potential threats, the way he positioned himself for optimal protective coverage, the absolute certainty in his bearing. This wasn't someone who'd gotten lucky during a crisis. This was someone who'd trained for exactly that crisis, and executed his training perfectly. Your soldier, Draven said, addressing the diplomat but watching the man. That level of discipline is remarkable. The ability to refuse a direct order while maintaining military bearing suggests training we don't typically associate with primitive species. There's that word again, the diplomat said. Primitive. You know what's actually primitive, Warlord? Assuming that military superiority equals strategic invincibility, assuming that conquered populations stay conquered because you have bigger guns, assuming that a species you've known for 2 years won't surprise you. She paused, then added with devastating casualness, assuming that the weapon you need to fear is the one being fired, rather than the one being deliberately lowered. The negotiations concluded successfully, establishing formal diplomatic and trade relations that carefully avoided any mention of restricted space incidents or execution orders. The Vorath Empire maintained its errad, those other ways, until a single soldier stood beside a diplomat, lowered his weapon, and made an entire empire blink. First military strength, but gained something it hadn't realized it needed: uncertain. The knowledge that overwhelming force wasn't always the answer, the understanding that sometimes the most dangerous opponent was the one who made you question whether fighting was worth it. 6 months after the incident, Draven found himself reviewing updated intelligence reports on humanity. Their fleet had expanded, Their technology had improved through trade agreements with species who suddenly found them very interesting. Their diplomatic corps had gained reputation as skilled negotiators, who played by rules the Vorath hadn't known existed. And throughout it all, military training footage showed human soldiers practicing exactly what that one soldier had done, standing down under direct orders, choosing loyalty over obedience, turning surrender into strength. They were preparing for the next confrontation, whenever it came, with species who thought force was the only language worth speaking. The galaxy had spent centuries assuming that wars were won by whoever brought the biggest fleet. The humans had suggested an alternative. Wars were won by whoever best understood that fighting was just one option among many, and sometimes the smartest move was standing beside someone, lowering your weapon, and forcing your enemy to realize they'd already lost. Draven filed his report, recommended continued diplomatic engagement, and privately acknowledged what the War Council would never formally admit. They hadn't retreated from a primitive species. They'd learned from a species that understood something the Vorath had forgotten in 6 centuries of easy conquest. Sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was choose not to demonstrate your power at all. The humans had apparently written entire military doctrines about that particular principle, and they'd tested those doctrines on the one empire that had never expected resistance to look like compliance, or strength to look like surrender. Turns out, there was more than one way to win a war. The Vorath just hadn't encountered those other ways until a single soldier stood beside a diplomat, lowered his weapon, and made an entire empire blink first.